Welcome back to another edition of the Night Report podcast. I'm your host, Mike Broadbent. Joining me once again is my co-host, Richie Schneiderite, and special guest today, Brock Heilig, to help us break down everything Michigan Wolverines. He covers Michigan for the Michigan Rivals site. So appreciate you joining us, Brock.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to breaking down this game on Saturday. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, so you guys have had a bit of an interesting offseason. This will be your first game with JimHarbaugh at the helm. Just talk about how the offseason's gone for the Wolverines.
It's been an interesting one. It didn't have very many slow days, that's for sure. From even a few days after the season ended, with a whole bunch of people had decisions whether they were going to enter the NFL or come back to Michigan, and then throughout the offseason, obviously the Harbaugh stuff. There were rumors earlier in the offseason that he might miss 4 games, and then they said he wouldn't miss any. And then, eventually the school settled on the self-imposed 3-game suspension, which obviously is now ended, and he's going to be back on the sidelines this weekend. But yeah, vibes around the team are high right now, especially with Harbaugh coming back. We were talking with some of the players the other day, and defensive end Jalen Harrell, he said that there's a little more juice in the building now that Harbaugh is going to be back. So, but even going back to January, like you were talking about, there were a lot of guys that could have gone pro. And, offensive linemen, Trevor Keegan, Zach Zinter, they both returned, and a whole slew of guys on the defense too. And, they all had the same goal in mind, and that's to come back and win the national championship. And, that can't happen until later down the road in December and January. But a good start to the season so far, and they're taking it one game at a time.
So it was a 4-game suspension originally. Did he see Rutgers at that 4th game and kind of was like, "Oh shit, I gotta get back"?
I don't know. Maybe he was a little worried about Greg Schiano's team, because Rutgers has given Michigan a little bit of trouble in the past. Last year in the first half, especially, it was a tight game, and even in 2020 when it went into double overtime, right? So yeah, maybe that's what he looked at, and he's like, "Oh, I got to be there for that."
Yeah, the 2021 game was close too. I think Michigan beat us 20-13, and I think that was the closest game you guys played all regular season too.
Yeah, I remember that one.
But you guys have had, 3 straight out-of-conference games to start the season. This will be the first Big Ten tilt of the season for Michigan. Talk about how the out-of-conference schedule went for you guys. I know that there was a lot of talk about maybe you guys were sleepwalking through the first few games, maybe bored, kind of playing with your food, I've heard people say on Michigan podcasts. Talk a bit about how the first 3 games have gone.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk within the fan base about, is playing three so-called cupcake games the right way to go, or do you want to kind of mix in some other Power 5 schools? But obviously Michigan chose to go the path of the 3 cupcake games, which it isn't a bad idea, because if you play a Power 5 game and lose, then your season's on the line basically the rest of the season from there on out. So yeah, Michigan, they didn't look terribly impressive in any of the 3 games, but especially in the first 2, they really went out and just got the job done. And then, in the 3rd game against Bowling Green this past Saturday, that's where fans really started to worry a little bit. And J.J. McCarthy didn't have his best game. In fact, it was probably his worst game in a Michigan uniform. He threw 3 interceptions and just looked a little bit off all night. But, yeah, Michigan, did what they had to do. And JimHarbaugh said in his press conference on Monday that, they're getting scrutinized for winning by 25 points against Bowling Green, which he said didn't make very much sense. So, they're getting the job done. They're winning games, which is all Harbaugh and the team really cares about.
I mean, to be fair, what was it, 6-7? Like right before it was about to be halftime, then you guys got another touchdown, I think, and then it was like 14-6 or something like that.
Yeah, it was 7-6 for a while. And Bowling Green actually had the ball 7-6 with a chance to take the lead. So yeah, it was a little tight there at the end of the first half for sure.
Was it like Mike said before, was it kind of just sleepwalking in that game, or was it more of like, I know JJ got hurt. I don't remember when he got hurt, but I remember reading he was limping at one point.
Yeah, that was in the second half, I believe. But if I don't know if they were really sleepwalking. They didn't have an excuse to be because it was the first night game of the season, and Michigan. I don't know if you guys saw they unveiled these new lights and they synchronized it with the music and everything like that, and it was a great atmosphere and probably one of the best at the Big House in a while. But maybe they came out and thought it's a night game against Bowling Green, who really cares, and they just figured we'll go out here and kind of give it 50% and walk away with a win. I don't know what they were really feeling and thinking heading into that game, but they definitely looked a little disjointed, especially on offense. The defense, kind of carried the team to the win. But yeah, the offense for sure. After Blake Corum, he led the game with a 54-yard run, and you're kind of sitting there thinking, okay, this is how this game is going to go. But after that, I mean, Michigan, after the first drive, I guess Michigan had a 4-play 75-yard drive or something like that in the first drive. But after that, it was tough for McCarthy, especially, for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, what would you attribute because obviously 3 interceptions versus Bowling Green. I know he also fumbled a snap, so he almost lost a fumble as well, and there was another fumble in the game. Like, were those just kind of like simple mistakes, or was that just Bowling Green kind of surprising him with a few different coverages? Like, what would you attribute the turnovers to?
Well, the first interception he threw, Michigan was driving, and Michigan was within 10 yards of getting a touchdown, and Roman Wilson was running this crossing route in the back of the end zone, and AJ Barner I think he was supposed to run a curl route and kind of sit right at the goal line. But instead of kind of curling, he sort of drifted, and Barner took his defender right into Roman Wilson's route. And so McCarthy thought he had Wilson open on the crossing route, and the defender kind of jumped in front of there. I wouldn't put that one entirely on McCarthy, more so on Barner maybe. But the second one that McCarthy threw, he was throwing to Cornelius Johnson on a deep post, and he probably saw this after the game. If you look on film, he had Roman Wilson again open on a post for a touchdown if he hit him, but instead he threw it to Cornelius Johnson. To me, it kind of looked like Johnson was supposed to kind of square off the route and cut under the defender. Instead, he cut over, and so the defender had the opportunity to jump in there and get the pick. And so neither of those two, I really don't put a whole lot of blame on McCarthy, but the third one, he was scrambling to his left, and he was just trying to make something out of nothing. And instead of throwing it out of bounds with no one open, he kind of forced it. I think he was throwing it to Colston Loveland, and a defender got in there and picked it off. That one was on him, and he said as much after the game in his press conference. He said, that's on me. I got to take that on the chin. So, yeah, like I said, not his best game. I don't remember the fumble right off the top of my head right now, but yeah, it wasn't a great showing for him.
Now, I mentioned it before. JJ was limping at one point. I believe you guys on Michigan Rival site reported that one of the defensive tackles might be out this week. What's the latest injury report for the entire team, I guess?
Yeah, Michigan's been a little banged up all season. The secondary, especially with cornerback Will Johnson, safety Rod Moore, and even safety Makari Page. Page played, I think, in 39 snaps on Saturday, which I don't think anyone was really expecting. I'm pretty sure he was listed as questionable and went out there and played 39 snaps. But Will Johnson didn't see any action in games 1 or 3, I believe. He played 8 snaps, I think, in week 2. And then Rod Moore, the starting safety, hasn't seen the field at all. And I don't think we're expecting him to be out there anytime soon. But yeah, Mason Graham, too, is a little banged up on the defensive line. And so you got a few pieces here and there that aren't quite there for Michigan. And on offense, McCarthy, like you said, was limping. Other than that, though, I don't think there are any key injuries there. He said after the game he was all good, and it was just, I think, his ankle, and it was kind of bothering him during the game. But he said everything's fine there. So yeah, Michigan, a little banged up, but nothing to really be too concerned about. Although, like I said, the secondary a little, what's the word I'm looking for? They're a little shorthanded, I guess, in terms of depth. Keon Sabb, has a true sophomore, has kind of stepped into that role to fill with Rod Moore being out, and Keyshawn Harris has stepped up in the absence of Will Johnson. I am expecting Makari Page to probably play on Saturday, so we'll see how that goes. But I know Rutgers has kind of struggled from what I've heard so far passing the ball, so maybe it'll bode well for Michigan that they have a matchup that doesn't thrive in the passing game as much.
Yeah, Rutgers hasn't really been tested at all. I think Rutgers has basically led the entire season, like all three games. Obviously they're big blowouts, each one of them, or not big blowouts, but they've won by 3 scores in every game. So they haven't really had the onus to have to pass. And Rutgers fans should recognize the name Keon Sabb. He's originally a South Jersey guy who ended up going to IMG before he went to Michigan. Let's talk about the Michigan offense. So obviously you're led by J.J. McCarthy and the dual threat of Edwards and Corum at running back. So just kind of talk about the kind of style of offense you guys run and some of the big playmakers to watch out for.
Yeah, well, the last 2 seasons, I'm sure a lot of people have come to realize that Michigan has really relied heavily on the offensive line and the run game, and that's kind of been the identity of the team. And so that's what's carried them to the 2 Big Ten championships. Has been the back-to-back Joe Moore award-winning offensive lines, along with Edwards and Corum, and even going back to Hassan Haskins back in 2021. But this year it seems to be a little bit different, especially with the emergence of McCarthy. Even though, like I said, he threw 3 picks on Saturday, he's still shown that he's kind of taken that next step in his development. And so, yeah, the passing game has kind of grown, and in doing so, the running game has kind of taken a little bit of a step back, which has kind of caused a little bit of concern among the fan base, is that the running game isn't looking as dominant as it had been in years past. And so that's kind of gotten some fans a little worried. Blake Corum rushed for, I think, 101 yards on Saturday, which was the first 100-yard rusher that Michigan had all season. And Corum is getting back to full strength after his injury last year against Illinois. So he's getting there. He looked a little bit slower and a little bit just unsure about himself in the first 2 weeks, but week 3, I thought he took a pretty big step getting back to full strength and full health. And then you look at Donovan Edwards. He had a big end to last season as he took over for Corum when Corum got injured. But the first 3 games of this year, Edwards really hasn't shown a whole lot. He's just kind of running into the back of the offensive line and not really finding the holes. Maybe it's a coincidence that when Edwards is out there just are no holes, and when Corum is, there are. But yeah, it's been a little bit concerning for Edwards so far. We'll see if he can get it going on Saturday. Now on the outside, like I mentioned earlier, Cornelius Johnson and Roman Wilson, those are the 2 guys to look out for, especially Roman Wilson with 6 touchdowns so far on the year. He had 3 in the season opener and
Wow.
2 weeks ago, and then 1 last week. So he's had a very good start to the year. And Cornelius Johnson too. He's only got 1 touchdown. And it was on a ball this past weekend that probably should have been McCarthy's 4th interception. But Cornelius Johnson had a wild circus catch. I'm not sure if you guys saw that. It was pretty wild. But yeah, Cornelius Johnson, Roman Wilson, those are the 2 to look out for. And maybe a sleeper receiver to look out for is Tyler Morris. He hasn't done a whole lot so far this year. He was open on Saturday. He had a defender beat by at least 5 yards, and McCarthy just overthrew him. Would have been his first touchdown of the year. But yeah, those are some of the guys on offense to kind of keep an eye out for.
Yeah, you guys have a pretty high concentration of touchdowns of looking here. So Blake Corum has all of Michigan's rushing touchdowns on the season, and Roman Wilson has 6 of the 7 receiving touchdowns on the season. So pretty wild. Sorry, Rich.
Yeah, there was.
No, you're good. I was going to ask you about the offensive line. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
You go.
No, I was just going to say there's a media.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Oh, geez. Yeah.
Sorry. I was going to say there's a media member.
You go. You're good.
Okay, there was a media member a few weeks ago that was asking Roman Wilson if he was going to share some of the touchdowns since he was kind of stealing them all from the other receivers. Like you mentioned, Mike, Roman Wilson has 6 of the 7 receiving touchdowns, and Cornelius Johnson just got his first this past week, and so I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, so you mentioned the offensive line, and I know you said it. Schiano even said it in his press conference. They're a 2-time Joe Moore Award winner. What makes them so good as a unit? Is it the coaching? Is it like the recruiting technique? Like,
I think it's a little bit of a mixture of everything. I'd say it's probably not as much so recruiting as it is technique and coaching and strength. The whole team has really raved about the strength and conditioning coach, Ben Herbert. He's really had a huge impact on the program as a whole, and you've been able to see that develop and flourish over the last few years, and he's really helped develop and grow these offensive linemen, and it's along with the coaching of Sharon Moore, who he was the interim head coach this past weekend, filling in for Coach Harbaugh. He is normally the offensive line coach when he's not, being the interim head coach. So, yeah, I think it's a mixture of Ben Herbert's strength and conditioning, helping them grow in that area, and then Sharon Moore really, really nailing down the technique. And I think a thing that doesn't get talked about enough is that the Michigan offensive line is just very experienced. If you look left to right, which they're still kind of figuring out the 2 tackle spots on left and right, but there's not a guy on that line who's younger than a senior. They're all either 4th year or 5th year seniors. So, they've had time to really get coached up by Sharon Moore all this time and grow under Ben Herbert. And so now I think, Michigan fans are finally starting to see that come to fruition. And they brought in a few transfers too. Ladarius Henderson and Miles Hinton on tackles. So, they haven't had as much time with Moore and Herbert as some of the others, but yeah, definitely a very, very strong offensive line. And something I'm looking forward to seeing on Saturday is how they're going to go about figuring out that tackle battle, because that's something that was really talked about a lot heading into the season. And even heading here into week 4, I still don't really think they've figured it out.
You're on mute, Mike.
You mentioned before there's been a kind of different amount of buzz now that Harbaugh's back. Do you expect this team to come out and play more fired up now that Harbaugh's back? Does he bring that much juice to the sideline? Do the guys really want to play for him that much?
I think they do, and I think we saw it in the season opener when JJ McCarthy came hopping off the team bus, and he was wearing a free Harbaugh shirt, and some of the other guys from the team were wearing one too, and they just missed their coach. McCarthy said so after the season opener. He said, "I just want my coach back." And Blake Corum has raved about JimHarbaugh, and a lot of the guys have really talked about how much he brings. And I do think they're going to come out with a little bit of firepower on Saturday, with him being back. And all. I think another thing is all the coaches that were interim head coaches will be returning to their normal positions and the normal position groups that they coach. And I think that'll really help, because on Saturday we saw, even though Jay Harbaugh wasn't the interim head coach, he's normally the special teams coach. Michigan had a fumble on a kickoff. They had actually 2. They lost one and recovered one, but it was back-to-back kickoffs that Michigan fumbled. Bowling Green had this little pooch kick trick, and so they would kind of pooch it to about the 30 or 35 and have someone other than the designated kick returner catch the ball, and it caused Michigan to fumble twice. So just the idea that the assistant coaches will all be, at their own designated areas, and Jim will be there and seeing everything as it's happening, I think that's really going to have a big impact.
So now what about this defense? I know Schiano in his press conference on Monday raved about him. He more specifically, the defensive line. I think he called it arguably the top defensive line in the country. Do you think that's kind of true and accurate?
It could be. I think we'll have to see a little bit once Michigan starts playing some better opponents. and better offensive lines and just overall better football players, right? And you're not getting a whole lot of that in the non-conference with what Michigan played, but the defense is looking really, really good, and like you mentioned, Richie, especially the defensive line, Kenneth Grant and Chris Jenkins and Mason Graham, even though he's kind of beat up a little bit, they're all looking really good on the interior. And in the season opener, Kenneth Grant had a pressure that forced the quarterback to throw off his back foot and throw an interception that Mikey Sainristil was able to grab. But just that pressure from the interior, I think, is what's really helping Michigan. And we've seen it a little bit on the edges too with Jalen Harrell, who JimHarbaugh said is a tone setter, and he forced an interception on Saturday, and he forced a fumble. So he's been looking really good. You got Braden McGregor on the other end, along with Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart. So just a really, really solid, really deep defensive line, and they haven't really ran up the sack numbers as some may have hoped. Like in the season opener, for example, they didn't have any, and I think they had 4 or so in each of the 2 past weeks, maybe, if my memory serves me correctly. But just a really solid, really deep defensive line. We'll see what they do with Mason Graham potentially being out on Saturday. I figure they might bring in a guy like Cam Good, who's a 6th-year player, I believe. He transferred from UCF a few years ago. So, they have the guys there to replace if injuries do happen, like we might see on Saturday.
He's still playing. That's kind of insane. I remember Cam Good. He's Maryland kid, I think, right? Or DC, one of the two. And he was UCF. He was somewhere else. And then he's like, damn, I can't believe he's playing still. That's just crazy.
Yep, he's still around. I think this might be his 3rd year now, 2nd or 3rd year.
It's insane.
So what would you say is the strength of the defense, and what would you say is the weakest link of the defense? I think I might know based on what you kind of already alluded to, but just to kind of go through what you point to as the biggest strength and biggest weakness.
Well, the biggest strength, I think, is the front 7. And like I just talked about with the defensive line, but even expanding further beyond that, at linebacker, you have Junior Colson, who's a junior, and he's just been really solid. He's been playing pretty consistently since his freshman season. And along with him, you have Michael Barrett, who's a 6th-year player. He was actually a quarterback in high school and had never played defense in his life when Michigan was recruiting him, and they were recruiting him to be a linebacker. And he took the challenge, and now here he is in his 6th year, and he's really flourishing. And you've got Ernest Hausman, a sophomore transfer from Nebraska, who played there as a freshman last year. So really, really good. The linebackers aren't maybe as experienced and as old as the defensive line maybe, even though, like I said, Michael Barrett's a 6th-year player, but Hausman just a sophomore and Colson just a junior. Whereas on the defensive line, you have a few more seniors with Chris Jenkins, Braden McGregor, and Jalen Harrell. So I'd say that's probably the strength. Now, if we're looking just at Saturday, I would say the secondary is a little bit of a weakness, but overall for Michigan, once they get their starters back, it may not be as much of a weakness. But if we're looking just at Saturday, Michigan might have some vulnerabilities back there. There was a passing play this past Saturday where Josh Wallace got beat bad. Josh Wallace is a transfer cornerback from UMass, and he's a 5th-year guy, I think, and he was a 2-time captain there. This is his 1st year with Michigan, and he got beat bad on a pass, and luckily for Michigan, the wide receiver dove for the ball in the end zone and couldn't bring it in. But there's a significant, maybe not significant, but there's a noticeable drop-off between a starter like Will Johnson, who's one of the best corners, if not in the Big Ten, maybe in the country, and a guy like maybe Josh Wallace or Keyshawn Harris or guys like those types. After that, it gets a little sketchy for Michigan because they have some freshmen that are next up on the depth chart after that, guys like Jair Hill and DJ Waller. So definitely not as experienced in the defensive backfield for Michigan. And, in terms of the Rutgers game on Saturday, that could be something that the Scarlet Knights could exploit maybe if Gavin Wimsatt can get going.
Now, what about the special teams? I know you guys got a transfer kicker in James Turner. I'm looking at his stats right now. It seems like he struggles with like a 50+ yardage, which I mean most kickers do. But other than him, is there anyone to watch out from the kick return game or punt return game?
It's funny you mentioned punt returners because Michigan doesn't seem to have a firm decision made in the punt returner aspect of the game. They started the season with a guy named Jake Thaw, who's listed as a wide receiver on the team roster. He started the year as the team's number one punt returner, and he kind of struggled a little bit throughout the first couple weeks. He let a few balls bounce that he probably should have just fair caught, and it kind of gave up some valuable field position and things like that. And so then Michigan brought in a freshman wide receiver by the name of Carmelo English. He returned a punt. I think it was week 1 in the second half, or maybe it was week 2. He returned a punt. He looked pretty solid, but then they've really relied on Tyler Morris, who I mentioned earlier. He's a true sophomore receiver. He's looked really, really solid. He had a 24-yard punt return in week 2, but it was called back. I think there was a running into the kicker penalty or something like that. And then he had another really solid one this past Saturday against Bowling Green. So, they've kind of been alternating from what I've seen. Like one punt return, it's Thaw, and then the next time that the opposing team is punting, it's Morris, and then it's back to Thaw, and they just kind of rotate. So I'd say look out for Morris, maybe more so than Thaw. We'll see if Michigan settles on Morris or whoever they decide to choose at punt returner. But yeah, definitely Morris has a little bit more explosiveness than Thaw does in the punt return game. And even going back to James Turner, like you were talking about, Richie, he's been solid. Michigan lost Jake Moody to the NFL this past offseason, which was a real bummer because he was far and away the best kicker in program history. He was just unbelievably talented, and so they brought in James Turner from Louisville, and first game of the year he missed an extra point, which is something that Moody never did. So I think it kind of caught Michigan fans by surprise, like, okay, this is what we're gonna have to deal with now that Moody's not here, right? So Turner's kind of settled in a little bit, though. I don't think he's missed a kick since then. He missed a 50-yarder or so in the season opener, but he's been automatic in weeks 2 and 3. So yeah, that's kind of the rundown on special teams there.
All right, so finish this sentence for me. Michigan wins if
Michigan wins if Michigan wins if JJ McCarthy returns to his old self, like he was playing in weeks 1 and 2. If he has a short memory and forgets about his bad game this past week and really focuses in on just being himself and showcasing his talents and just playing free like he was in weeks 1 and 2, I think Michigan's going to win, and I think it's going to be tough really for any team to stop Michigan if McCarthy's playing at the level that he was in the first 2 weeks.
All right, so we've kind of exhausted everything between, offense, defense, narratives. Let's get down to predictions. Well, you're the guest, so we'll let you get the first one in. This is a game that opened up at Rutgers. It was a 31.5-point dog on Sunday, and that got bet down almost immediately. Within like 8 hours, it got bet down to 24.5. So how do you see this game playing out? Let's get your prediction for the game, Brock.
I've got Michigan winning, and I'll give a score in a minute. But I think it's funny how quickly the line was bet down because Michigan hasn't covered in any of their first 3 matchups, and they were, I think, 35+ point favorites in all of them, and they hardly even scored 35 points. They didn't score 35 points in 2 of the 3. So I think it's just funny how high the line opened. I didn't know it opened at 31. I saw it at 26 or something like that, which I think is a little more reasonable. But yeah, I've got Michigan winning. I've got them 35-13. I just think overall too much talent for Rutgers to handle. Even though the Scarlet Knights have, caused Michigan some problems in the past few years, I think this Michigan team is just on a mission. And I'm a little concerned that Rutgers has struggled to throw the ball, even though they've been ahead. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Rich, you want to go next?
Yeah. It's tough. It is tough because like they've had their struggles for Michigan. Rutgers has had their struggles too, rightfully so. I know the scores don't really reflect it, but the third quarter in the past two games versus Temple and Virginia Tech were like brutally ugly to the point where both teams
six drives, no scores, all punts. I think we had one or two first downs in the third quarter on offense.
13-point swing against Virginia Tech at one point, and it's like, oh geez, but I can't see Michigan not winning this one. I think like 31-13 is probably about right, and that hits the 44 right there. That's the over under, and it's weird. It's close, but I think Rutgers will probably cover though, and I think that's 31-14, 31-13. What did I say? 31-13? Is that cover?
Yeah, you said 31-13.
Yeah. So yeah, I think they cover because Rutgers is 3-0 against the spread, so they might just go 4-0 and complete opposite of Michigan. But yeah, 31-13 seems about right because, like you said, the pass game is kind of awful. The run game is pretty good though, but is the offensive line going to be able to stop that Michigan defensive line that's a terror? So we'll wait and see on Saturday, but I'm going to go 31-13 Michigan.
Yeah, I also am having a hard time rationalizing, even as a fan, Rutgers winning this game. I think Rutgers will keep it way closer than the line would indicate. I do think this is a game that will be a one-score game for a while. But I do think that if J.J. McCarthy comes out and plays like he did last week, where he's, putting the ball in harm's way a lot, I do think Rutgers wants to get ahead and just grind the game out. These new clock rules have been like a godsend for Greg because he just all he wants to do is, run, maybe do a play action pass, run some more. So if Rutgers can get out to some kind of lead and Schiano can play Schiano ball, I do think this is one Rutgers can stay in for a while. That being said, Rutgers hasn't been in a position where they've had to really throw to win games this year, and they're going to be in that position against Michigan. And I don't know if Gavin's ready for that kind of situation. I'm going to go with Michigan 31, Rutgers 14. Pains me to say it, but I think Rutgers' undefeated season is snapped at 3-0, and they go into the big house and they lose a game that's probably closer than the score would indicate, but I think they do end up losing by at least 2 scores. Brock, thanks for coming on. Where can the people find you and your work, both you on social media and where your work is?
Yeah, on social media, I'm just at Brock Heilig on Twitter, or on X now as they call it, and I'm with Michigan's rivals site, michigan.rivals.com, Maize and Blue Review. So that's where you can find me on X and on Rivals, all that kind of stuff. So
sweet.
Perfect. Well, thanks once again for joining us. For those listening at home, this has been another edition of the Knight Report podcast. Signing off.